The Arithmetic of Time. Professor Matthias Adler had devoted most of his life to numbers, yet he had never believed them to be neutral. As a historical demographer based in Basel, he specialized in population statistics, archival census records, and the subtle narratives concealed within dates that most people recited without reflection. To him, numbers were neither sterile nor purely quantitative, they were compressed stories, waiting to be unfolded. His fascination began not with equations but with a family ledger discovered in his grandfather's attic. The pages were brittle, inscribed with meticulous columns of births, marriages, deaths, and harvest yields dating back to the late 19th century. At first glance, the document appeared purely administrative, yet Matthias sensed that each date marked an inflection point in someone's existence. A single entry, October 14, 1918, stood out, followed by a brief annotation and a sudden shift in handwriting. It was the day his great-great-uncle failed to return from the war. From that moment onward, Matthias understood that numbers could carry grief as effectively as prose. The difference between 1913 and 1919 was not merely 6 years, it was a rupture. The interval between two census counts could represent migration, famine, recovery, or disappearance. He became increasingly attentive to how historical trauma was often archived in numerical form long before it was articulated in memoir. During his doctoral research, Matthias analyzed demographic fluctuations across Europe between 1850 and 1950. His work required him to confront columns of mortality rates, fertility indices, and migration percentages that appeared impersonal in isolation. Yet when plotted across decades, the figures revealed unmistakable patterns of upheaval. A sharp decline in 1914, a partial stabilization in 1920, another contraction in 1939, dates that students memorized as abstract milestones materialized in his data as measurable human consequence. Colleagues often described his methodology as rigorous to the point of severity. Matthias insisted on precision, distinguishing carefully between correlation and causation, between projection and verified record. He argued that a single misinterpreted percentage could distort an entire narrative. Accuracy, in his view, was an ethical obligation rather than a technical preference, particularly when dealing with statistics that represented lives rather than commodities. Despite his commitment to empirical clarity, Matthias was aware of the seductive authority numbers could exert. Percentages lent arguments an aura of inevitability, as though numerical expression equated to truth. He cautioned his students against mistaking quantification for comprehension. A rise from 2.3 to 3.1 children per household signified more than a decimal increase, it reflected shifting economic conditions, cultural expectations, and generational aspirations. Invited to lecture in Boston on the philosophy of statistics, Matthias began his presentation with an unconventional question: when does a number become a date, and when does a date become memory? The audience, composed largely of economists and historians, responded with analytical frameworks, yet Matthias steered the discussion toward interpretation. He suggested that the calendar itself was an architecture of meaning, partitioning time into segments that allowed human beings to impose coherence on continuity. Outside academia, Matthias cultivated a quieter habit of recording personal milestones with meticulous detail. He noted the exact hour he first met his partner, the temperature on the morning his daughter was born, the duration of the train journey that carried him to his inaugural professorship. These annotations were not obsessive but contemplative. They functioned as anchors, preserving moments that might otherwise dissolve into indistinct recollection. Over time, he began drafting a monograph tentatively titled The Arithmetic of Time, in which he explored how societies ritualized numbers. Anniversaries marked 10, 25, or 50 years as though round figures possessed intrinsic significance. Birthdays divisible by decades were celebrated with heightened ceremony, while irregular intervals passed unnoticed. Matthias questioned whether such numerical preferences shaped perception more profoundly than acknowledged. His research extended into financial crises, where he observed how dates became shorthand for catastrophe. A single year, 1929, 2008, could encapsulate complex economic collapse. Yet these temporal labels risked flattening nuance. The downturn did not begin precisely at midnight on January 1, nor did recovery commence cleanly on December 31. Numbers offered boundaries, but lived experience rarely conformed to them. In seminar discussions, Matthias challenged students to consider how digital culture intensified numerical consciousness. Social media metrics quantified approval in real time, transforming human interaction into countable units. Followers, views, percentages of engagement, these figures subtly recalibrated self-perception. He wondered whether an existence measured continuously might feel less stable, perpetually subject to statistical evaluation. As the manuscript progressed, Matthias grappled with the paradox that numbers, though abstract, could evoke powerful emotion. A survival rate of 97% reassured, yet the remaining 3% unsettled. The difference between 1 and 0 was absolute. In clinical trials, in electoral margins, in accident reports, the smallest numerical variation could alter interpretation dramatically. He reflected on how humanity oscillated between trusting numbers implicitly and fearing their implications. During a sabbatical in Florence, Matthias immersed himself in Renaissance account books preserved in municipal archives. The ledgers documented expenditures for bridges, cathedrals, and public festivities, revealing how civic ambition was translated into currency and chronology. He marveled at how meticulously recorded sums and dates allowed centuries-old decisions to remain legible. Without those annotations, architectural grandeur would lose its temporal coordinates. Yet the longer he studied, the more Matthias sensed that numbers did not merely record history, they shaped it. Tax brackets influenced migration, interest rates affected birth patterns, census classifications determined political representation. Quantification guided policy, which in turn altered demographic reality. The relationship between number and event was reciprocal rather than linear. Approaching his 60th birthday, Matthias found himself contemplating his own timeline. 60 years sounded definitive, almost architectural in its symmetry, yet he felt no abrupt transformation at that threshold. The date arrived quietly, indistinguishable from the day before. He recognized then that while calendars provided structure, meaning accumulated gradually, often imperceptibly. In the final chapter of his monograph, Matthias proposed that numbers and dates functioned as instruments of orientation rather than destiny. They allowed societies to track change, allocate resources, and commemorate experience, yet they required interpretation to acquire significance. A statistic devoid of context risked abstraction, a date without narrative risked forgetfulness. On an autumn evening, reviewing proofs of his book, Matthias paused at a passage describing the year of his grandfather's birth. The digits appeared ordinary on the page, yet they represented the beginning of a lineage that had culminated, at least for now, in his own daughter's curious gaze. The arithmetic connecting those years was simple subtraction, but the lived interval contained immeasurable transformation. He closed the manuscript with a renewed conviction that numbers were not cold artifacts of logic but coordinates of human passage. They marked beginnings and endings, expansions and contractions, certainties and approximations. When treated with care, they clarified complexity; when invoked carelessly, they obscured it. For Professor Matthias Adler, the study of numbers was never solely about calculation. It was about acknowledging that every figure, however precise, existed within the vast and intricate continuum of time.